Hello everyone, and welcome back to another video in the Engaging with Art series. Today we are doing a follow-up to our first choices and tools video, and in this case we are looking a bit more specific. Instead of being broad, like, discussing choices, today we're going to focus on tools, and we're going to look specifically at drawing. The reason I want to start narrowing the scope a bit to drawing is because obviously it's my medium, but that does not mean I'm an expert. So let's make that clear right away. And that's one of the beautiful parts of being an artist, is it's very much being a lifelong learner in so many regards, especially when it comes to one's own tools and the mastery of those tools and then the possibilities of those sorts of tools. This is not going to be an exhaustive list of possibilities when it comes to drawing or the tools that are utilized. Art is incredibly open-ended and always evolving, so it's impossible to create like an exhaustive list of the possible ways that people can use a medium. My goal with this video is to offer you some ideas, not necessarily to pigeonhole you into one sort of approach. The whole series is about engaging with art, right? And I want to use drawing as our first means of narrowing the scope when it comes to tools, to offer examples and to bring in some exemplification that's going to help facilitate your experience when you approach certain art, in this case drawing. Again, though, it is really important to mention that experimentation is something that's major in art, and it's always ongoing. Just like I mentioned with the process video, there are as many processes in this world as there are artists, because each process is individual and unique to an artist. So too are there that many ways that people are going to experiment with drawing and with the tools and different types of tools you can use that are still kind of defined as drawing, if that makes sense. And I think that's a good segue into defining things. So I want to start by laying the parameters, like, what are we talking about here? What are my definitions I'm using for drawing? And what is the specificity I'm trying to sort of put everything together in? The focus today is how an artist uses the medium to render an image. We are specifically looking at the tools the artist is using that are defined as drawing or fall like under that umbrella, and how they are applied to the canvas, not necessarily the content. I want to just sort of try to shed light on how an artist uses the tools and makes choices with those tools, and what those effects can have, not necessarily the content of a piece. So that's, I think, really important to establish right away. Now, when it comes to my definition for drawing, like, what do I mean by that when we're trying to establish this? The distinction is a tool that creates semi-permanent linear strokes self-sufficiently on the picture plane when applied. The concept there is we are working with something that creates line, that does so of its own accord, which I think is what separates it from paint, because a paint requires the brush as well as the paint itself. Like, the pigment is coming from an outside source, and that's where I had like the self-sufficiency thing. And the picture plane obviously is whatever canvas you're using. That's my loose definition, but again, you can very quickly see how the line gets really fuzzy, right? Because there are plenty of painters who do straight lines, or there are plenty of other media that can create very straight lines on a canvas. But I want to try and narrow the scope. Again, I'm trying to just offer us some groundwork from which to build upon. Right away after I say that definition, I'm sure you can start to think of ideas, right, in terms of what are the tools that could be used to create what is defined as a drawing by this metric. Pencils come to mind at first, of course, and then colored pencils, which is what I use as well. Some other things that I put down here: charcoal, crayons, pastels even could. And pastels get a little bit weird though, right? Because even with charcoal, you have the ability to create really broad strokes with those media. You don't necessarily have to use pinpoints to create linear strokes. Some other options, could be pens or markers. I'm not trying to be really flighty about the definition here. I just want to lay some ideas out there, and I want to give you a groundwork. So hopefully you and I both understand what I mean when I say drawing in this context. In describing some of the different possible tools, the reason we do that is because when you break down what is being utilized and how it's being utilized, it's going to lead you to start considering why. And as soon as we start considering why, that's sort of like our goal, right? That's the place we want to be at, because when we start asking the questions, we start discovering more about the work and the answers. So in that respect, let's start there. When you're approaching a drawing, the first thing you want to do is establish what tools are being utilized. What am I seeing when I look at this drawing that's being used? Right away, start making that list in your head. Am I seeing graphite, charcoal, colored pencil, marker, pen, etc.? I think it's also really important to recognize, is one tool being used in isolation, or are there multiple media being used together? Are we seeing graphite and colored pencil? Are we seeing pen and crayon? Are we seeing, a multitude or a few? Another important thing I think to really remember, not to forget, is what is our picture plane, right? So which again means what is the media being applied to? Is it newsprint? Is it canvas? Is it paper? What kind of paper is it? Is it Bristol paper? Is it mixed media paper? Not only are they going to affect how the medium is being picked up, like how the tool appears on the picture plane is going to be affected by that, but again, it's a choice that the artist made, and there's a reason for it, and it's worth trying to understand that. Once we've established the tools, it's time to start asking questions about the application of those tools, meaning how were they applied and in what fashion are they appearing on the picture plane. One of the starting points to ask is the medium visible on the surface? And by that I mean, are you able to see the strokes, or is there blending going on that sort of hides the strokes? A good example of that is hyperrealism. If you see hyperrealistic renders of objects especially, a lot of times what you see is the image of the object, and you don't perceive the fact that there's actually graphite or pen or whatever built up to it. So the artist can make that choice whether they want you to see the strokes or whether the strokes are something that is being hidden, and deliberately so. Another question to ask, something that's again on the surface, is this monochromatic or is this polychromatic? Meaning, are we working with one color or many colors? Is it a vast palette of different hues, or is it one solitary hue and maybe different shades? I think one thing to consider here is with graphite. Graphite typically is one color, I think we would think, like one hue. It's that gray graphite hue. It's going to be monochromatic, but you're still going to probably see the variation in values if that's something that makes sense. Returning back to our idea of stroke, like I mentioned, if the strokes are distinguishable, and sometimes even if not, ask yourself, is there motion to them? I wrote down some adjectives here because I think it's great to bring adjectives to the fore, right? Like, consider ideas like frenetic, frantic, hyper, high intensity, straight, angular, precise. Ask yourself, are these qualities that I'm recognizing? As you start to describe it to yourself and describe the motion, this is again revealing more and more about how these tools were applied. And in that same vein, consider how the strokes are appearing. In this case, think of words like bold versus faint, thick versus thin, broken up versus complete. Sort of similar to how it might have motion, but at the same time, these sort of stand on their own. You can imagine a very bold, thick, straight line that could have been produced by one very thick point. For example, if we were working with markers, it could have been a very thick marker tip, or you might be looking at very minute pinpoint lines, strokes, created by a very, very tiny pen with an incredibly small point to it. All of these things are useful for us when we're considering a drawing because they are all choices the artist made. All of this that I'm describing to you is about observation. All of this is about sitting before the drawing and soaking in these initial details, soaking in these much to do with surface aspects, much to do with the qualities and the character of the drawing on the surface. We then can start to ask ourselves, what is the effect that this has on me as the viewer, and also on the work itself? Before I go too much further, I just want to stress that these things that I'm giving you, these observations, I hope they're just a starting point. I hope you can sort of formulate some other ones too, as you're looking at a drawing and other ideas of things you could ask yourself. This is very much the cross section between the application of the medium and the content of the work itself. We start to consider how the choices that we've discovered affect us in our understanding of the piece. We're talking tools here, but it's tools and choices, because truthfully, the tools and how they were used are always choices by the artist, and these choices were done in a way to affect the actual content of the piece. What we've been doing in our process, observing and engaging with the art as I've described, is all leading us back to this idea of understanding the piece. We have to consider both what is being used and how it's being used. Then we can start to look at the actual content of the work. Am I seeing shapes? Am I seeing forms? Am I seeing recognizable objects? Am I seeing imagery that is realistic, or is it surrealistic? Is it, of this world, or is it out of this world? Is it something that I would observe happening, or something that is impossible? We consider the content, we consider what we actually see in the work as the content of the work, and we take that along with the observations we've made about the qualities and the application and those choices that we've found within the work, and we ask ourselves, how do they affect our perception? How do the qualities we've observed affect our perception, understanding of the content, essentially leading us closer and closer to what the artist is trying to do. What effect they have is going to lead us to ask the why. In some ways, it's kind of like a math equation, or it could be like a detective, or like a scrutiny, where you're trying to marry all of these things together in order to approach the why of what the artist is trying to do, what the artist is trying to say, how the collision of all of these things at once have an effect, and why they have an effect, and what they're doing. As you can see, it's all sort of like the tip of the iceberg. Today we've just been talking about the observable qualities of a drawing and how the tools are applied to the canvas, and then we get to the content question, right? Then it seems like it opens up an endless stream of possibilities, because then art is about so many diverse different things that it can just go on and on. Since that all seems like a pretty good stopping point, I want to discuss, the things you can do in this aspect, and trying to create your own sort of habit of thinking about and observing these qualities. One great thing that I thought of is search online for some drawings to observe, and then take, like what I was discussing today, like write down what you see using the questions and start to analyze the piece. Find a drawing from maybe even a famous artist, and then just write down some of the descriptions that I've described, right? Like, what are the tools being used? How are they applied? What are the sort of qualities that you're seeing in that application of those tools? And then you can start to ask, okay, now what's the drawing about? What am I seeing pictured before me? And then start to ask yourself, how is the quality affecting the perception of the content? The beauty of all this too is there aren't necessarily right and wrong answers, right? Like, it's all just about trying to get a deeper understanding. Another great thing I think you can do is pick up a pencil. If you see artwork, especially modern contemporary work, that seems simplistic, or, oh, I can do that sort of approach, pick up a pencil and try. Markers, pencils, pens, crayons. Like I said, there are a lot of different things we can describe as drawing, and try to replicate what you see. When you step in a very visceral way and try to create those qualities, like try to create your own representation of the visual that you see before you, you're going to start to better understand what the artist was doing in the production. Even if the approach you take and the process you take isn't what the artist was doing, this is a way to sort of create a weird sense of empathy, maybe, in order to help you better understand how the artist got to the end product. In some instances, I think you'll discover, and maybe in a lot of instances, that it's definitely not as easy as it looks. But then on the other hand, you might start to just understand how a tool is used and the actual tactility of applying that particular tool to a canvas. One funny thing I want to leave you with in that regard, in terms of like what it feels like to apply one particular tool to a canvas. I work with colored pencils, like I've mentioned, and I've been using oil paper, which is actually used for painting, but it's something that I use because of my resin pores. And I have days where my colored pencils quite literally feel, when I'm putting them on that extremely coarse and very heavily toothed oil paper, I have days where it feels like you're applying crayons to concrete. Like, it can be so temperamental and it can be so coarse. So that's just one example of how you might look at the end product with my pieces and see the figures rendered in maybe a smooth fashion, But the reality is that when I'm applying that, there are some times when it just feels like the paper is eating the pencils. It is so coarse and rigid. I think I'll stop there today. Thank you so much for joining me for another video. I hope this has been inspiring, and I hope this gives you just an idea to consider drawings in general. Please feel free to share this with anybody who might find it worthwhile, and until the next one, take care everybody. Bye-bye.